Just want to talk through with you one of the handouts I have about close reading. Close reading is a skill that we'll be learning about through the course of the semester. And I just put together 10 things that I think about when I read poetry or prose, fiction, any kind of creative writing, even creative nonfiction as well. It's a thoughtful analysis and critical of a text or even a small section of a text. In fact, I think the word close implies that you sort of put a microscope in on the text and you emphasize a particular area and then see how it relates to other parts of the story or the text that you're reading about. And it's a skill that most literary critics have, and that is important to think about how to enhance our interpretive and critical thinking skills. Makes us more careful readers and more attentive to detail. So throughout this course, we'll be working on developing our skills of close reading, and that means that we will become better at noticing details in literature, at getting to understand references and allusions to things, at recognizing patterns, at being able to describe tones in writing, and at comprehending figurative language and reading more complex texts and then being able to write about them. So the 10 things that I ask people to think about, and we'll be sort of studying these as we go through the course, is one, be an active reader. Read with a pencil or an online highlighter. In most PDFs, you can actually save a draft with your highlights, and you can even underline and make notes in PDF files. And I can show you how to do that in class. You want to read a text more than once when you're doing close reading. And if you're particularly looking at a passage, you want to pick a passage that either seems confusing to you or speaks to you in some way, or maybe works against the grain of the text that you're reading. So that leads me to the second point of noticing anything that seems to call attention to itself, any kind of repetition, unusual introduction of words or strange character names, out of place phrases, any kind of contradictions or inconsistencies in what you're reading. Those are moments that might open up a kind of critical thinking or interpretation about the piece of writing you're reading. I also want you to always think about the form the writer is reading, is using. What are they choosing to express their ideas and their stories through? It could be a series of letter writing, like in the novel The Perks of the Wallflower, which is all by letters. Or it might be that they choose a poem and a particular kind of poem. So always pay attention to the form that a writer chooses. They often connect very strongly with the content that a writer is using. Also pay attention, number 4, to the voice or the narrative point of view. Who's speaking? If you're reading a short story or novel, who's telling the story? If you're reading a poem, whose poetic voice do you hear? How can you imagine that person? Think about also the audience and purpose. To whom does the writer seem to be speaking? Can you figure out why they would be writing to that particular audience? Does that audience seem to have a certain prior knowledge? Does the writer use a certain kind of diction or vocabulary to attract a certain kind of audience? Connotation and denotation. We will spend a whole class period of the course thinking about this, but this is how language moves into the sort of from the literal to the figurative. And we're going to think about how our brains make that leap and how writers use connotation and denotation to create meaning within their writing. Also, always look for imagery and metaphors and symbols. These are all examples of figurative language, which are the non-literal meaning of words. And that's poets and fiction writers play with the depth of what words can mean to evoke different connections for readers. Um, Characterization. Think about who the main character is, who's the protagonist, who's the antagonist. How do these characters relate to each other? Do they use a particular kind of language? Later in this semester, we'll be looking at dynamic characters and characters that change versus characters that are stock characters, and how writers use the functions of the character to get their story across. Also, think about syntax and diction. Syntax is the way sentences are ordered, the literal sort of ordering of how a sentence rolls out. And diction refers to the kind of words being used. So if you're reading a poem, does it have a lot of language that seems sort of medical in some way or religious in some way? That would be the kind of diction. And then finally, my 10th point is to pay attention to the beauty and the terror. Be alert to the beauty that you see when you're reading something. Stop and take note of that and the pleasure in what you read, but also in the moments that might terrify you, that you think are a bit too far or too out there or repulse you in some way. These are moments to pay attention to as much as the moments that feel kind of beautiful and pleasurable. Okay, that's it about close reading, but we'll do more of this as the whole semester goes on. Just wanted to give you a brief overview.